That seat isn't mine. Jonathan Mercer said it quietly, but the words traveled farther than any toast delivered from the stage that night. The ballroom at the Langford Hotel held nearly 400 people, yet the sound seemed to drain out of it all at once. Forks paused above white china. Crystal glasses stopped clinking. Even the jazz trio near the windows seemed to soften beneath the weight of that single sentence. Jonathan stood at the head table with one hand resting on the back of a high-backed chair. A polished brass nameplate sat in front of it, engraved with his title in clean black letters. Jonathan Mercer, Chief Executive Officer. My wife, Claire, stood beside him in a navy evening dress, her smile fixed in place, one hand still hovering near the chair as if she had personally presented it to him. 20 feet away, I sat near the service doors beside a stack of folded banquet linens and a silver coffee station that hissed every few minutes. From where I was sitting, I could see the exact moment Claire realized something had gone wrong. Her shoulders tightened first. Then her eyes moved from Jonathan to me. She had expected him to sit down, thank her, and accept the arrangement without question. Everyone had. After all, he was the most powerful man in the company, and I was only Ethan Walker, the quiet husband who worked from home, wore the same charcoal suit to every corporate event, and never corrected anyone when they assumed Claire paid most of the bills. Jonathan looked down at the nameplate again. Then he lifted it between two fingers. He did not appear angry. That would have been easier for Claire. Anger can be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Calm is harder. Calm makes people listen. Mr. Mercer, Claire said, keeping her voice low, we adjusted the seating at the last minute. I thought you'd be more comfortable here. Jonathan turned toward her. His expression remained polite, almost gentle. I was already assigned a seat. Claire gave a small laugh, the kind she used during difficult presentations when she wanted everyone to believe nothing was wrong. There must have been a mistake on the chart. No, he said. The mistake happened after. The chart was printed. Mason Reed, the company's chief operating officer, sat 2 chairs away with a glass of bourbon resting near his hand. Until that moment, he had been smiling. Now he leaned back slightly, studying Jonathan the way a man studies a locked door after realizing he has misplaced the key. Around the table, senior executives exchanged careful glances. None of them knew what Jonathan knew. Claire did not know either. That was the part that hurt more than losing the seat. My wife of 11 years had moved my name without asking because she believed my place beside her was negotiable. She had not done it during a crowded registration mix-up. She had done it deliberately, with enough time to remove my brass nameplate, hand it to a server, and send me to a table near the kitchen. She had looked me in the eye and called it practical. Jonathan stepped away from the chair. He carried his nameplate to the empty setting 2 places down, where the original seating chart had placed him. Then he returned to the head position and pulled the chair back. The legs moved softly across the carpet, but every person nearby heard them. Claire's face lost color. Jonathan glanced across the ballroom at me. He did not wave. He did not announce my name. He simply placed his hand on the chair and waited. That gesture changed the temperature in the room. People who had ignored me 10 minutes earlier began turning in their seats. Claire followed their eyes until she found mine. I did not smile. I did not stand immediately. I let the silence settle because silence has a way of revealing what people say when they think you have no value. Jonathan finally spoke again. Ethan, he said, would you come back to your seat? The invitation was courteous, but the room heard something else beneath it. Recognition. Respect. History. I rose slowly and buttoned my jacket. Claire watched me cross the ballroom as though I had become a stranger between one breath and the next. But I had not changed. I was the same man who had arrived with her 20 minutes earlier, before the music started, before the awards were announced, before she removed my name from the head table and whispered the sentence that would end our marriage long before either of us admitted it. Please don't make this difficult, Ethan, she had said. Tonight, that table is for people who actually matter. The sentence stayed with me as I crossed the carpet toward the head table, but it had started nearly an hour earlier, inside our car beneath the hotel entrance lights. Claire had been checking her reflection in the passenger mirror while I waited for the valet. She adjusted one pearl earring, smoothed the front of her navy dress, and looked at me as though I were another detail she needed to manage before walking inside. Tonight matters, she said. Jonathan Mercer will be there. The board will be there, and Mason says the promotion announcement could happen before dessert. I told her I understood. I had attended enough corporate dinners to recognize the rhythm. Handshakes in the lobby. Polite laughter near the bar. People repeating one another's names so nobody forgot who mattered. Claire turned toward me and lowered her voice. Please do not talk too much about your consulting work. I looked at her. Why? She hesitated just long enough to make the answer obvious. Because people do not understand it. You say you advise private companies, but you never give names. It sounds vague. I watched the valet open her door. It is private work, Claire. I know, she said quickly. I am not criticizing you. I just need tonight to stay focused. That had become one of her favorite phrases during the past year. Stay focused. It usually meant stay quiet, stay agreeable, and do not make anyone ask questions she did not want to answer. Inside the ballroom lobby, a young event coordinator handed us place cards and directed us toward the seating chart. Claire found our names at the head table. Hers was beside Mason Reed. Mine was beside hers. Jonathan Mercer had been placed 2 chairs farther down, next to the chairwoman of the board. It was a careful arrangement, the kind companies build after several meetings and too many emails. Claire stared at it longer than necessary. That is strange, she said. What is? Jonathan should be at the center. Maybe he requested otherwise. She did not answer. Mason appeared beside us a moment later, wearing a black tuxedo and the relaxed smile of a man who believed the evening had already gone his way. He congratulated Claire on her presentation, shook my hand without looking directly at me, then studied the seating chart. They put Mercer down the row? He asked. Claire nodded. Mason laughed softly. That will look terrible in the photographs. He looked at my name, then at me. No offense, Ethan, but this is an executive event. Claire gave him a thin smile. I waited for her to correct him. She did not. Instead, she touched my arm and said, "We will figure it out." Those 4 words made something settle cold in my chest. Not because I did not know what she intended, but because I did. A server was placing brass nameplates along the table when Claire walked over. I watched her speak to him, point toward the center chair, then gesture toward the tables at the back of the room. The server looked uncomfortable. Claire smiled until he obeyed. He lifted my nameplate and carried it away. She never asked me. She never even turned around first. When she returned, she spoke in the careful tone people use when they have already made a decision and want to call it a conversation. There is an open seat at table 23. I glanced past her. Table 23 sat beside the service corridor, nearly 40 feet from the stage. And Jonathan? I asked. He will sit with me. That was my seat. Her mouth tightened. Do not make this symbolic. That was the strange part. It was symbolic before either of us said a word. A nameplate is only a piece of metal until someone decides your name can be moved. A chair is only furniture until your wife gives it away to prove she understands the room better than you do. Mason watched from the bar, pretending not to listen. Claire stepped closer. This is one night, Ethan. Jonathan is the chief executive officer. The people at that table are making decisions about the future. I looked at the empty place where my name had been. And what do you think I do all day? She exhaled, already impatient. That is not what I mean. Then what do you mean? Her eyes moved toward a group of senior executives entering the ballroom. She lowered her voice. I mean, this table is for people with momentum. People who are going somewhere. There it was. Not anger. Not cruelty delivered loudly enough for witnesses. Something quieter. Something she had probably believed for a long time. I picked up my water glass and nodded once. All right. Relief crossed her face so quickly that she did not realize I saw it. She believed I had surrendered because I did not argue. She believed silence meant weakness. Then she leaned closer and said the words I would remember long after the music stopped. Tonight, that table is for people who actually matter. I walked to table 23 without raising my voice. I sat beside 2 junior analysts and a retired accountant whose hearing aid kept whistling during conversation. From across the ballroom, Claire never looked back. But Jonathan Mercer did, the moment he entered the room and saw where she had put me. Jonathan Mercer did not walk toward the head table when he entered the ballroom. He stopped beneath the chandelier, scanned the room once, and found me beside the service corridor. That was how Jonathan operated. He noticed what other people overlooked, especially when someone hoped he would not. Claire was already standing near the center chair, greeting board members and adjusting the place settings as though the evening belonged to her. Mason Reed remained close enough to appear helpful, offering handshakes, rehearsed compliments, and small corrections to everyone around him. From table 23, I watched Jonathan speak briefly with the chairwoman of the board. She pointed toward his assigned place, 2 chairs from the center. He looked at the brass nameplate, then at the chair Claire had prepared for him. His expression did not change, but his gaze moved to the server who had carried my name away. The young man answered a quiet question and pointed toward me. Jonathan nodded once. He understood the entire scene without needing anyone to explain it. The retired accountant beside me leaned closer and asked whether I knew him. A long time ago, I said. That was true, though it left out almost everything that mattered. Jonathan crossed the ballroom at an unhurried pace. People straightened as he passed. Conversations softened. Claire saw him coming and brightened instantly. She stepped toward the center chair and placed one hand on its back. Jonathan, we made a small adjustment, she said. This gives you the proper position for the photographs and the announcement. He looked at the chair, then at her. Who was assigned here? Claire paused. Ethan, originally, but he understood. Jonathan glanced toward me. Did he? Mason joined them with an easy smile. It was just a practical change. Ethan is comfortable at another table, and this arrangement makes more sense for leadership. Jonathan turned to him. Leadership according to whom? Mason gave a short laugh, then stopped when Jonathan did not join him. Claire lowered her voice, but the people nearest the table were already listening. There is no need to make this awkward. Jonathan placed his fingertips on the brass plate bearing his name. I agree. He lifted it and walked to the seat the event planners had assigned him. The chairwoman watched in silence as he set the plate down beside hers. Then Jonathan returned to the center of the table. He pulled the empty chair away from the linen and looked toward the service corridor. That was when he said the seat was not his. The sentence was not loud, but it settled over the room with the weight of something official. Claire tried to recover. Jonathan, I thought this would be more appropriate. Appropriate for what? He asked. For the company. He studied her for a moment, and I could see she was searching his face for the version of the conversation she had expected. She wanted gratitude. She wanted approval. Instead, Jonathan asked the server to bring back the missing nameplate. The young man disappeared through the service door and returned less than a minute later, holding the small piece of brass in both hands. Jonathan accepted it, wiped a faint fingerprint from the surface with his pocket square, and placed it at the center setting. Ethan Walker. My name looked almost severe beneath the ballroom lights. Jonathan stepped behind the chair and faced me. Ethan, he said, would you come back to your seat? Everyone at table 23 turned toward me. The junior analysts looked confused. The retired accountant smiled as though he had solved a puzzle before anyone else. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and crossed the room. I could feel the attention following me, but I kept my eyes on Jonathan. He extended his hand when I reached the table. His grip was steady and familiar. It has been too long, he said. I prefer quiet rooms, I replied. You always did. Claire stood less than 3 feet away, watching the exchange. Her smile had disappeared. Jonathan pulled the chair out for me, but before I sat, he leaned close enough that only Claire and I could hear him. You gave me this company, he said. I can give you back a chair. Claire inhaled sharply. I looked at her, not with satisfaction, but with the tired clarity that arrives when a private truth finally becomes visible. She had spent years telling people I handled small consulting projects from home. She had never asked why chief executives returned my calls on Sundays or why attorneys sent documents by private courier. She had mistaken my silence for emptiness because silence had no title she could place on a seating chart. I sat beside her, exactly where the planners had intended. Jonathan returned to his assigned place without making another statement. No announcement followed. No explanation rescued Claire from the questions forming around the table. Mason lifted his bourbon but did not drink. The jazz trio resumed its song. Servers began setting down the first course. The evening moved forward, but nothing had returned to normal. Claire leaned toward me and whispered, "What did he mean?" I unfolded my napkin and placed it across my lap. Which part? Her eyes moved toward Jonathan, then back to me. About the company. I looked toward the stage, where a screen displayed the Meridian Crest logo above the words "Building Tomorrow Together." You wanted tonight to stay focused, I said. So let us focus. She stared at me for several seconds before turning away. Across the table, Mason was already typing a message beneath the edge of the linen. He understood more than Claire did. Jonathan had not returned my seat as an act of courtesy. He had returned it because the most important vote in Meridian Crest history was less than 12 hours away, and mine was the only vote Mason could not afford to lose. Claire did not ask another question during the first course, but silence had never suited her when she could not control what it meant. She cut her salmon into smaller pieces than necessary and glanced toward Jonathan whenever he spoke to another board member. Mason kept his attention on his phone until the chairwoman asked him twice whether he had heard her. Around us, the room slowly returned to conversation, but the people at our table had changed the way they looked at me. 10 minutes earlier, I had been an inconvenient spouse moved out of a photograph. Now they were trying to calculate the distance between what Claire had told them and what Jonathan had revealed. I had watched that distance grow for years. It began with small omissions. At a charity breakfast 3 years earlier, Claire introduced me to a regional director as someone who did a little consulting from home. I had just finished advising a manufacturing company through a $200 million restructuring, but I let the description stand. Correcting her in public would have embarrassed her, and back then I still believed protecting her dignity protected our marriage. At another event, a photographer asked us to stand together near the company banner. Claire looked toward the executive team and said spouses would be photographed later. Later never came. The picture appeared online the next morning with Claire in the front row beside Mason, smiling beneath a caption about the leaders shaping the future. I was visible only in the reflection of a glass door behind them. I remember noticing that reflection while drinking coffee at our kitchen counter. I could see the outline of my suit, half hidden by the glare, present but easy to miss. That became my place in her public life. I was invited, but not included. Acknowledged, but never explained. When she earned her vice president title, I planned a dinner at the restaurant where we had celebrated our first anniversary. I reserved the corner table, ordered the same bottle of California Cabernet we had shared 11 years earlier, and brought the leather portfolio she had admired for months. She arrived 40 minutes late with Mason and 2 directors because a meeting had run long. Claire asked whether they could join us. I said yes. The waiter added 3 chairs, and our anniversary became an informal strategy session. She opened my gift between discussions about market positioning, kissed my cheek, and thanked me in the same tone she used with the waiter. On the drive home, she said the evening had been perfect because Mason finally saw how supportive I was. I stared through the windshield and wondered when my support had become a performance review. I had helped Claire prepare for every important step of her career. During graduate school, I read her presentations at midnight and listened while she practiced difficult answers in our living room. When she traveled, I handled the house, the bills, and the calls from her father after his surgery. When Meridian Crest offered her a position in Chicago, I rearranged my work so she would not have to choose between marriage and opportunity. I never kept score because I thought marriage was the one place where scorekeeping meant both people had already lost. Claire did not become cruel overnight. She became selective. She stopped telling new colleagues that I had helped build companies. Then she stopped mentioning my work at all. Eventually, she began speaking about me as if I were a kind man who had failed to become impressive. At home, she still asked me to review speeches and solve problems she could not discuss with her staff. In public, she turned me into background. The contradiction should have warned me sooner. People reveal their priorities through repetition, not confession. A forgotten introduction can be an accident. A dozen forgotten introductions become a decision. Across the table, Claire finally set down her fork. "Why did you never tell me?" she whispered. I kept my eyes on the stage where technicians were testing the microphone. "Tell you what, that Jonathan knows you like that." I turned toward her. "You were there when he came to our house 8 years ago." Her brow tightened. "That was him. He sat at our dining table for 3 hours. You said he was a former colleague." "He was." Claire looked down as though searching her memory for details she had once considered unimportant. That evening, Jonathan had arrived without a driver, carrying financial reports in a plain cardboard box. Claire had greeted him, poured coffee, then left for a networking dinner before he removed his coat. She never asked why he stayed until midnight. She never asked why I spent the following week in calls with attorneys. She had decided my work was too vague to matter, so every clue passed through her hands without leaving a mark. "You should have explained," she said. The words landed softly, but the blame inside them was familiar. I folded my hands beside my plate. "I tried." She opened her mouth, then stopped. Perhaps she remembered the evenings when I mentioned an investment meeting and she changed the subject to her promotion. Perhaps she remembered calling my legal documents boring, or joking that my office looked like a room where old companies went to disappear. Before she could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed. Mason rose from his chair and walked toward the stage with the confidence of a man who believed the night still belonged to him. Claire straightened immediately. Her questions vanished behind her professional smile. Jonathan leaned toward me and spoke without looking away from Mason. He changed the presentation this afternoon, he said. He thinks the board has already agreed. I watched Mason place both hands on the podium as the Meridian Crest logo filled the screen behind him. Has it? I asked. Jonathan shook his head. Not while your signature is missing. Then Claire stood, smoothed her dress, and followed Mason toward the stage, carrying a speech she had never allowed me to read. Claire reached the podium beneath a wash of white light, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had imagined herself looking all evening. Calm. Accomplished. Certain. Mason stood several feet behind her with his hands folded at his waist, watching the room as though every chair already belonged to him. The screen displayed a silver rendering of a new corporate campus, all glass walls, green rooftops, and carefully placed trees. Beneath it appeared the words Meridian Crest Next. Claire smiled at the audience. For more than 20 years, Meridian Crest has grown by recognizing opportunity before others could see it. Her voice carried cleanly through the ballroom. I had heard her practice that tone hundreds of times at home. Warm enough to sound human. Precise enough to sound prepared. She spoke about expansion, innovation, and a new strategic partnership that would position the company for national leadership. She never used the word sale. Mason had chosen partnership because it sounded temporary and cooperative. Sales sounded like surrender. Jonathan sat motionless beside the chairwoman. Around the table, several board members exchanged looks. They had approved a preliminary review, not a public announcement. Claire continued. North Star Dynamics brings resources, infrastructure, and market access that will allow us to reach customers in ways we could not achieve alone. Applause rose from the middle tables, led by managers who had clearly been told when to respond. Mason nodded with quiet satisfaction. I looked at the screen and thought about the first Meridian Crest office, a rented warehouse west of the city with one working heater and rainwater collecting in plastic bins near the back wall. There had been no glass campus then. No gala, no polished language, just 12 employees, a failing product, and 11 days of payroll left in the bank. Jonathan had called me on a Tuesday night after 2 investors withdrew. I drove 90 miles through freezing rain and found him sitting on the concrete floor beside a stack of unpaid invoices. He did not ask me to save the company. He asked me how to close it without ruining the people who had trusted him. That question was why I helped. Not because the technology was valuable, though it was. Not because I expected influence, though influence came later. I helped because Jonathan cared more about the employees than the name on the building. We rebuilt the software, architecture, renegotiated the debt, and moved key patents into a protected holding structure so no desperate executive could sell the foundation for short-term relief. I invested enough to cover 6 months of payroll. Jonathan accepted the role of chief executive officer. I remained outside the spotlight, holding the voting rights that could stop the company from abandoning its original purpose. Claire knew none of that because by the time I met her, Meridian Crest was stable and my involvement had become private. I told her I managed investments and advised companies. She heard flexible schedule. She saw an office at home. She decided the work must be small because it did not require applause. On stage, Claire advanced to the next slide. It showed rising revenue projections, new regional offices, and a line climbing toward the upper right corner. There was no slide showing what North Star planned to remove after the agreement. No mention of duplicated departments. No acknowledgement that nearly 600 employees could be classified as operational overlap within 18 months. This is not simply a financial decision, Claire said. It is a statement about who we intend to become. Jonathan leaned toward me. That sentence was not in the version the board received. I watched Mason. It sounds like him. It is. Claire glanced toward our table, and for half a second her eyes found mine. I could not tell whether she was looking for reassurance or trying to measure how much I understood. Then she turned back to the audience. Tomorrow morning, our board will take the final step toward approving this historic partnership. That line changed the room. The chairwoman stopped writing. Jonathan's expression hardened. Two directors looked directly at Mason. There was no final approval scheduled. There was a vote on whether to continue negotiations, and even that vote required review of updated conflict disclosures. Mason had turned uncertainty into theater. He wanted employees, executives, and local reporters to leave the ballroom believing the decision was complete. By morning, any objection would look like sabotage. Claire finished to strong applause. Mason joined her at the podium and thanked her for her leadership. He placed one hand near her shoulder without touching it, a careful public gesture designed to suggest alliance. Claire smiled toward the cameras. I felt no jealousy. What I felt was colder and clearer. She had attached her credibility to a plan she had not examined because Mason promised it would carry her upward. When they returned to the table, Claire sat beside me with controlled excitement. Now you understand why tonight mattered, she whispered. I understand more than you think. Mason raised his glass toward Jonathan. To the future. Jonathan did not lift his. Before we toast, he said, perhaps we should discuss the documents North Star filed this afternoon. Mason's smile remained, but his fingers tightened around the stem. Nothing material changed. Jonathan looked at me. Ethan received the documents before I did. Claire turned so quickly that her chair brushed the carpet. Mason stared at me across the table, and for the first time that evening, he stopped pretending I was only someone's husband. I reached inside my jacket and placed a sealed envelope beside my brass nameplate. Something changed, I said. The question is whether you expected us to notice before or after the vote. The envelope remained unopened for 3 full seconds, which was long enough for everyone at the table to understand that Mason already knew what was inside. His expression did not collapse. Men like Mason rarely lose control in public. Instead, he adjusted his cuff, leaned back, and gave me the kind of patient smile reserved for people he believed were about to embarrass themselves. Ethan, he said, whatever private material reached you was probably an incomplete draft. I rested one hand beside the envelope. It is the amended acquisition agreement filed at 4:17 this afternoon. The chairwoman turned toward him. Amended how? Mason glanced at Claire before answering. That single glance told me more than his words would. He had expected her to help shape the story. North Star revised several compensation provisions, he said. Nothing that changes the value of the transaction. Jonathan's voice stayed calm. Then you will not object to opening it. The room around us was still applauding the next award recipient, but our table had become a sealed world of lowered voices and careful breathing. I broke the envelope and removed 23 pages held together by a black clip. I did not hand them to Mason. I passed them to the chairwoman. She turned to the marked section near the back. Her eyes slowed as she read. $7 million, she said. Claire looked at Mason. What is $7 million? The chairwoman lifted her gaze. A transition consulting payment to an entity called Reed Strategic Partners. Mason exhaled through his nose. That is standard executive retention compensation. Reed Strategic Partners was registered 6 weeks ago, I said. Its mailing address belongs to your brother-in-law. Claire's face changed in a way I had seen only once before, when she learned that a promotion she had expected had gone to someone else. It was not guilt. It was fear of being standing too close to failure. Mason turned toward me. How did you get access to this? Jonathan answered before I could. He has access because North Star cannot purchase the protected assets without his consent. Claire stared at Jonathan, then at me. Protected assets? I looked toward the silver Meridian crest logo glowing above the stage. The operating platform, the core patents, and the licensing architecture. Mason gave a dismissive shake of his head. Those belong to the company. The company has an exclusive license, I said. Ownership remains with Walker Ridge Holdings. The chairwoman stopped turning pages. One of the directors lowered his glass. Claire whispered my last name as if she had never heard it clearly before. Walker Ridge had appeared on tax documents, courier labels, and legal folders in our home office for years. She had seen it often enough to ignore it. You own the patents? She asked. I control the trust that owns them. Mason leaned forward. That structure was created during the restructuring. It was never intended to obstruct a legitimate sale. It was created precisely to prevent leadership from selling the foundation of the company. Without independent review, my voice never rose. It did not need to. 12 years earlier, Meridian Crest had been days from closing. The original founders had pledged nearly everything to keep the doors open. then lost control when the debt came due. I rebuilt the system in exchange for ownership of the intellectual property, but I refused to place that property directly inside the corporation. Companies change. Boards change. Ambition changes faster than both. So the patents went into Walker Ridge Holdings with a licensing agreement that could survive ordinary growth, but not a sale designed to enrich a few executives at the expense of everyone else. Jonathan had called it a lock on the emergency exit. I had called it insurance against forgetting who built the building. Mason knew the structure existed. What he had not known was that I still controlled it personally. My name had disappeared from annual reports after I withdrew from public leadership, and he had mistaken privacy for absence. Northstar's attorneys reviewed the license, he said. They believe the consent requirement can be challenged. They believed that yesterday, I replied. Today they added a clause requiring Meridian Crest to guarantee your consulting payment even if the protected assets are excluded from the purchase. The chairwoman found the clause and read it twice. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Mason looked toward Claire again, but she no longer met his eyes. You told me this was about growth, she said. It is, he answered. Compensation does not invalidate the strategy. No, I said. The hidden compensation invalidates your credibility. A server approached with coffee, sensed the tension, and quietly moved away. Around us, the gala continued beneath soft music and warm light. People laughed. Cameras flashed. From the stage, an employee thanked the company for believing in her. The contrast made the document feel heavier. Meridian Crest had 847 employees across 4 states. To Mason, they had become numbers beneath a rising line. To me, they were the reason the lock existed. Claire reached for my sleeve, then stopped before touching it. Why did you never tell me you controlled something this important? I looked at her. Because every time I tried to explain my work, you called it boring. She lowered her eyes. Jonathan closed the agreement and placed it in front of Mason. Tomorrow's vote is postponed. Mason's smile finally vanished. You cannot do that without board action. The chairwoman folded her hands. We can when a director fails to disclose a financial interest. He looked from her to Jonathan, then to me. This is not over. No, I said. It is not. Across the ballroom, the screen changed from the silver campus rendering to an old photograph that had not appeared in any approved presentation. 12 people stood inside a cold warehouse surrounded by folding tables, exposed cables, and unfinished server racks. I was near the center, younger by 12 years, with my sleeves rolled up and a marker in my hand. Claire turned toward the screen. Jonathan rose from his chair. There is something this company should have acknowledged a long time ago, he said, walking toward the stage, and I realized he was about to return more than my seat. Jonathan reached the podium while the old photograph remained on the screen behind him. The applause that usually followed his appearance did not come immediately. People were too busy studying the image. 12 younger faces stood beneath fluorescent lights in a warehouse that looked more like a repair shop than the beginning of a technology company. Extension cords crossed the concrete floor. Winter coats hung from metal shelves. A portable heater sat near the edge of the frame. I stood beside Jonathan with a marker in one hand and a diagram covering the wall behind us. Claire looked from the photograph to me, then back again, as if enough attention might reveal how she had missed an entire chapter of my life. Jonathan adjusted the microphone. Most of you know the version of Meridian Crest that came after this picture, he said. You know the headquarters, the regional offices, the product awards, and the years of steady growth. What many of you do not know is how close this company came to disappearing before any of that existed. The ballroom grew still. Mason remained seated, but he no longer looked at the stage. He was watching the exits, the board members, and the sealed agreement in front of him. Jonathan continued. We had 11 days of payroll left. Our primary system could not scale. 2 investors had withdrawn, and our largest customer was preparing to leave. I believe the responsible decision was to close the company before we failed the employees who trusted us. He turned slightly and looked toward me. Ethan Walker disagreed. Every face at the head table followed his gaze. I felt Claire studying me from inches away, but I kept my attention on Jonathan. He had offered to acknowledge my role many times over the years. I had always refused. Public recognition brings questions, and questions had once reached too close to people I loved. Ethan did not arrive with a speech, Jonathan said. He arrived with a thermos, 2 legal pads, and a plan that required most of us to admit we had built the wrong system. A few people in the photograph laughed quietly from their tables. They remembered. He worked here for 4 months without taking compensation. He rebuilt the core architecture, negotiated emergency financing, and used his own capital to make sure every employee received a paycheck on time. Then, when the board asked him to lead the company, he declined. Claire whispered, "Why?" The microphone did not catch her, but I heard. Jonathan answered the question without knowing she had asked it. Ethan believed leadership should belong to the person most willing to protect the people inside the company. He chose me. I have spent 12 years trying to deserve that choice. This time the applause came. It began near the back of the room, where several longtime employees had stood. Then others joined them. The sound rose, warm and sustained, but I did not feel victorious. Recognition cannot restore the years in which the person beside you chose not to see. Claire placed her napkin on the table. Her hands were unsteady. "You founded this with him," she said. "I helped rebuild it. And you never told me. I told you parts of it." She shook her head. "Not this. You never stayed long enough to hear this." Her eyes filled with something more complicated than embarrassment. Memory was arriving all at once. Jonathan at our dining table. The private couriers. The calls that stopped when she entered my office because the matters were confidential. The annual trips I described as trust meetings. She had interpreted every quiet detail in the smallest possible way because the larger version did not fit the story she told about me. Jonathan waited for the room to settle. Several years after that photograph was taken, Ethan stepped away from public leadership for personal reasons. He asked that his role remain private, and we respected that request. Perhaps we respected it too completely. The screen changed to another image. My mother stood beside me at a company picnic, wearing a red scarf and holding a paper cup of lemonade. The photograph had been taken 3 weeks before her diagnosis. I looked down. Claire knew about my mother's illness, but she did not know how aggressively reporters had pursued our family after learning that Walker Ridge had financed several major companies. One photographer had waited outside her treatment center. A business reporter had called her hospital room pretending to be a relative. That was the week I decided influence was useful only when it stayed quiet. I transferred public responsibilities, placed the ownership structure behind professional trustees, and disappeared from the photographs. Jonathan understood. Claire had never asked. "Privacy is not the same as insignificance," Jonathan said. "And humility should never be mistaken for a lack of authority." The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Claire stared at her plate. Mason finally stood. "This history is inspiring," he said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "But it does not change the strategic merits of the North Star transaction." Jonathan looked toward the chairwoman. "No. The undisclosed compensation changes that." Then he looked at me. "And there is another matter." The ballroom screen went dark. A moment later, an audio file appeared, marked with the time and location of a conversation recorded less than an hour earlier. Mason stopped moving. Claire lifted her head. The location displayed on the screen was the head table, center seat, and I understood why Jonathan had insisted that no one leave the room. Claire had moved my chair to help Mason control the evening. Instead, she had placed him directly beneath the event recorder when he quietly discussed the payment he believed no one else knew existed. The audio did not begin with Mason discussing money. It began with the scrape of a chair, the clink of ice against glass, and Claire asking whether Jonathan would appreciate being moved to the center of the table. Her voice sounded lighter through the ballroom speakers, almost cheerful. Mason answered that Jonathan would appreciate the photographs, and that appearances mattered more than seating charts. Then came a pause. Fabric shifted near the microphone hidden beneath the floral centerpiece, part of the hotel system used to capture speeches and table remarks for the anniversary video. Nobody had placed it there to investigate Mason. It had been installed before Claire moved the chairs. That was the detail he could not explain away. His voice returned, lower this time. "Once tomorrow is finished, the North Star people will release the transition payment. $7 million through the advisory company, just as agreed." Another man answered from farther away. I recognized the voice of Daniel Price, North Star's senior vice president of acquisitions. "Only after the protected assets transfer." Mason gave a quiet laugh. "They will transfer. Jonathan wants the deal, the board wants the deal, and Walker is not even part of the room anymore." The recording stopped. Nobody applauded. Nobody whispered. Silence spread from the head table outward as people realized the celebration around them had been built on a decision that had never actually been made. Mason stood beside his chair with one hand resting on the linen. "That conversation is being taken out of context," he said. Jonathan remained near the podium. "Then provide the context." "It was preliminary compensation planning." The chairwoman looked at him. "For a payment you did not disclose." Mason turned toward the ballroom technician. "Who authorized this recording?" "The hotel." Manager stepped forward from near the stage. "All table microphones were disclosed in the event agreement. They are used for the company anniversary archive. Your office approved the equipment list." Mason looked toward Claire. She had approved the final program after his staff sent it to her. I could see the memory reach her. 2 weeks earlier, she had complained over breakfast that the production contract was too long to read, then signed it before leaving for work. Now her name sat at the bottom of the document that made the recording legitimate. She lowered her eyes. "Turn it off," Mason said. Jonathan did not move. "It is already off." "Then delete it." The chairwoman closed the acquisition agreement. "No one is deleting anything." Mason looked around the table for support, but the people who had laughed with him earlier were suddenly interested in their water glasses. Power does that. It gathers noise when it appears permanent and loses its voice the moment people see the foundation move. Daniel Price had left his seat near the stage. 2 North Star attorneys followed him toward the lobby without speaking to anyone. Their departure answered a question the board had not yet asked. Jonathan returned to the table and sat in his original place. "The transaction is suspended," he said. "Effective immediately." Mason shook his head. "You do not have unilateral authority." "I do not need it." The chairwoman raised her hand. One director after another followed. Within seconds, a majority of the board had voted to suspend negotiations and begin an independent review. No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just hands rising beneath warm chandelier light, while the future Mason had announced disappeared one vote at a time. He looked at me. "You planned this." "No," I said. "You did." His expression tightened. "You held the document until tonight." I received the amended filing at 5:42. I brought it because the board needed to see it before tomorrow. I glanced at the microphone beneath the centerpiece. "The rest happened because you believed no one important was listening." Claire closed her eyes for a moment. She understood what I meant. She had placed Mason in the center because she believed importance followed titles, cameras, and chairs. The move had put his private conversation directly beneath the clearest recorder in the ballroom. The choice that removed me from the table had preserved the evidence that stopped him. The chairwoman asked hotel security to escort Mason to a private conference room until corporate counsel arrived. Nobody touched him. Nobody raised a voice. He buttoned his jacket, collected his phone, and walked away beneath the attention of 400 employees who had applauded his vision less than an hour earlier. When the doors closed behind him, the jazz trio remained silent. Claire turned toward me. Her professional smile was gone. "I did not know about the payment," she said. "I believe you." Relief flickered across her face, but I was not finished. "You still stood on that stage and promised hundreds of people a future you had not examined." Her lips parted. "Mason gave me the projections. And you trusted the promotion more than the questions." She looked toward the screen, where the warehouse photograph had returned. "What happens to me now?" It was the first question she had asked all evening that was entirely honest. She was not asking about the marriage. She was asking about her title. I looked toward the chairwoman, who was already speaking with corporate counsel by phone. "That decision cannot belong to me," I said. "Why not?" "Because I am your husband, and because power becomes corruption the moment I use it to settle something personal." Claire stared at me, as if restraint confused her more than revenge would have. Jonathan approached the table and placed a folder beside her plate. Inside was a notice of independent review covering the acquisition campaign, the altered seating plan, the public announcement, and every communication between Claire and Mason during the previous 6 months. Her name appeared at the top of the first page. Jonathan spoke gently. "You will have a fair process." Claire looked at me again. "Will you help me?" I studied the brass nameplate in front of me, the one she had removed less than 2 hours earlier. "I will tell the truth," I said, "but I will not protect you from it." The drive home took 34 minutes, and Claire did not speak for the first 27. Chicago moved past the windows in ribbons of white headlights and red brake lights. But inside the car, the silence felt sealed. She held the review folder on her lap with both hands. The Meridian crest logo faced upward like an accusation. I kept my eyes on the road. At a stoplight near Wacker Drive, she finally said, "Are you leaving me?" I did not answer immediately. 12 years of corporate history had been revealed in less than an hour, but the question between us had been building much longer. "I do not know what is left to stay for," I said. She turned toward me. "That is not fair." "No, it is not." Her voice tightened. "I made one bad decision with the seating." I looked through the windshield as the light changed. "You did not move a chair, Claire. You moved me." She stared at the folder. "I was under pressure." Pressure does not create values. It reveals them. The words settled between us. She looked out her window, and for several miles, all I heard was the soft movement of paper beneath her hands. When we reached our house, she followed me into the kitchen without removing her coat. The room looked exactly as it had that morning. 2 coffee mugs near the sink. A bowl of apples on the counter. Her calendar opened beside the refrigerator. Ordinary things have a cruel way of surviving important nights. Claire placed the folder on the table. "Tell me everything," she said. "About Walker Ridge. About Meridian Crest. About all of it." I loosened my tie. "Why?" "Because I am your wife. You were my wife yesterday." She flinched, but I did not raise my voice. I was too tired for anger. Anger still expects something to change. "I tried to tell you," I continued. "You called the trust meetings boring. You laughed when I said I was reviewing licensing agreements. You introduced me as someone who did small projects because that version made sense to your colleagues. I did not understand. You did not ask." Her eyes lowered. That was the difference she could not escape. Ignorance can be innocent. Indifference is a choice. She sat at the kitchen table and opened the review notice again. "Will I lose my job?" "Possibly." "Can you stop it?" "Yes." She looked up quickly, and the hope on her face told me more than I wanted to know. "Will you?" I pulled out the chair across from her, but remained standing. "No," her hope disappeared. "You said you would not use power to punish me." "I will not." "Then help me." Interfering would not be help. It would be another kind of corruption. She closed the folder. "So you are going to let strangers decide my future?" "An independent committee will decide whether your actions violated company policy. They are not strangers. They are the process you defended when it applied to other people." She looked away. The next morning, I arrived at Meridian Crest before 7. The executive conference room overlooked the river, gray beneath a cloudy sky. Jonathan sat at one end of the table. The chairwoman sat at the other. Corporate counsel Rebecca Sloan placed 3 folders in front of us. Mason had been suspended pending investigation. Northstar had withdrawn its proposal before midnight. The board still needed my formal vote to prevent the protected assets from entering any revised transaction. Rebecca reviewed the documents, then slid the final page toward me. One signature could end the sale. I signed. No speech. No celebration. Just ink crossing paper. Then Claire's review came next. Rebecca asked whether I wished to remain. "No," I said. "I am recusing myself from every discussion involving her employment." Jonathan studied me. "You understand the committee could recommend termination." "I understand." "And you will accept the result?" I looked through the glass wall toward hundreds of employees beginning their day. Some carried coffee. Some checked phones. None of them knew how close their jobs had come to becoming entries in a severance spreadsheet. "The rules have to matter when they hurt," I said. I left the room before Claire arrived. We passed each other near the elevators. She wore a gray suit and held the same leather portfolio I had given her on our anniversary. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "I know who you are now." The elevator opened behind me. I stepped inside and faced her. "That is the problem," I said. "You should have known before," Jonathan told the room. The doors began to close. Claire stood beneath the fluorescent lights, still holding the gift I had chosen when I believed support could save what respect had already left. Just before she disappeared from view, she asked, "Who are you going to be after this?" I looked at my reflection in the elevator doors. "The same man I was before," I said, "only no longer invisible."